Hello, this is Professor Bustillo-Booth. This is our video wrap-up, Part 1, titled Motivating Employees for Business 101, Introduction to Business. During weeks 7 through 8, we discussed several topics: workforce motivation, human relations, and marketing. For this particular installation, I'll focus only on Chapter 9, Motivating the Workforce, and I'll try to bring in the online discussion we had on motivation, as well as to provide context for your Connect interactives where you had case studies about particular companies and their efforts to motivate their employees, as well as the discussions around motivational theories. As always, we want to begin with some definitions. And human relations is the study of the behavior of individuals as well as groups in an organizational setting. And motivation is that inner drive that directs a person's behavior towards goals. And a goal is an aim or a desired result. And the need is a difference between a desired state and actual state. This will be fairly important to understand why we pursue motivational strategies, is because of this difference. Before we go much further, let's revisit the management roles. There were 4 of them, one of which was planning, which is a development of tactical plans. Those are the short-term plans, less than a year, and strategic plans, which are long-term plans, typically between 1 and 3 years. The second role was that of organizing, which is the structuring of resources. And again, when we talk about resources, we're talking about people, time, and money. And the third role is that of leading, which is the motivating and leading of employees. And then lastly, the role of controlling, which is evaluating and correcting of activities to help the company stay on course. And all of these are in order to meet organizational objectives. And if you're asking yourself, where then does motivation reside in these roles, one can argue that in all of them, motivating employees is important. But really, there are 2 areas that are affected the most, and that is in organizing and leading. And particularly organizing in the sense that that's really where HR resides, the idea of staffing, right? And that leading, of course, has a lot to do with motivating people so that they can meet organizational objectives. So this is really where I want you to kind of wrap your mind around where motivational strategies are really relevant. Now, this desired state really represents our organizational goals and the attainment of them. And sometimes we don't attain them. So we have some other state or the actual position of where we are currently, and that the difference between that desired state and the actual state is the need, whether that be at the individual level or at the organizational level. The motivational strategy's aim is to eliminate that gap so that organizational goals can be met. In order to understand motivational theories, it's really helpful to kind of go back in time and understand its historical roots. Frederick Taylor is the father of the classical theory, and he was around the 19th century, early 20th century. And during that time, there were a lot of factories, right? And that they were staffed by self-styled workers. So things were not standardized. They would use rules of thumb, and it would differ from one person to the next. And the overriding sort of belief at the time was that if workers became very efficient, then there would be less workers needed. And so what they did was they would slow the work down and soldier on to protect their interests. Well, Taylor, a mechanical engineer, did not believe that. And he wanted to employ scientific means to understand management. And what that meant is that he would use sort of the systematic study of the structure and behavior of management through observation and experiment. That led to the scientific principles to management. And what that did is that it led to this, standardization, so that work could be more efficient, so workers could be more productive. And what's interesting here is he argued that if workers were more productive, and there was less waste in time and money, then that would result in lower prices of those items that were produced. And if those items could be lowered in price, then more people would want those items. And if people wanted more of those items, then there would be more work demanded. There would be more workers needed to meet the demand. That was his argument. Because he was a mechanical engineer, he had that mindset of breaking things down to its component parts. And his means to doing that was the time motion studies. And so he would observe, and he would break down a process into its micro level parts and time them and break them and figure out the one best way to perform a function. And once he's figured it out, he would standardize it. He would say, okay, so this is the way it has to be done because this is the best way to do it. It would be most efficient, which would then result in more productivity. And this led to the hierarchy of management, where managers were regarded as thinkers. They were the ones who were going to design the work and tell the workers what to do. So employees became the doers. They became, the input was not sought. They just had to do what they were told. And Taylor also believed that most workers were motivated by money. And many of you in our online discussions actually noted that this is still true today. And arguably that is the case. People are motivated by money because money allows for a quality of life. All right. So according to Taylor, if you paid people more, they would become more productive. And they would have to do this by being specialized in what they did. So they would do that one or two things really, really well, and they would get paid for those things that they did really well. They call that a piece rate system. And so they tied pay to productivity. This would require managers to select and train high-performing workers to do the jobs best suited to them, and then let go of others not meeting those standards. And today's application of this is pay for performance. So you may hear that term when you listen to the news, read the papers, go on your social media. And behind pay for performance is really this notion of standardization, so that things can be more efficient, so that people can be more productive, so that you can meet organizational objectives, and that there was a way to measure success. Another application today is that of automation. And automation, at the very root of it, is standardization and efficiency. And you can see that the historical roots of it are alive and well today, as opposed to people doing the work in a standardized fashion. We are increasingly relying on robots as well as software to be able to do those things so that we're more efficient. Another foundational theory was born out of the Hawthorne studies, and these were conducted in 1924 through 1932 by Elton May and a set of Harvard researchers. And they were really looking at environmental factors. So for example, they looked at the effect of lighting, more or less lighting, on the productivity of workers. And in this case, they found that lighting did not actually have much of an effect at all. And so they found this to be very curious because they fully expected that it would. And so they continued to observe the workers and also interview them. And what they found was that productivity and morale was largely a result of friendly coworkers, caring supervisors, and a sense that work mattered. Imagine that. And that unlike what Taylor had proposed, and that sort of standardizing the work down to its mechanical parts and really treating people as sort of extensions of machines. In their studies, they found that workers had, productivity ideas that not only improved the product, but also improved the process, and that they, in fact, could be counted on to contribute their ideas. So this idea of a hierarchy of management where managers were the thinkers and that, the employees were mindless doers sort of ran counter to the studies. And so this led to more studies and the induction of human relations at work. So this was actually quite monumental to really see workers as people. HR then is sort of the embracing of needs and beliefs and expectations as motivators for folks at work so they can be more productive. At the bottom line of that is that there needs to be a balance between the worker's needs and the job needs, and that in order for this to work, management would have to be participative. If you're interested in this subject, there are actually several classes I highly recommend to you. One is Business 240, which is HR in the workplace, Management 276, which is employment law, Management 295, which is HR management, and then Management 296, current trends in HR. These classes, along with maybe a couple of other classes, make up the HR certification that it's highly valued. And if you are serious about HR, I highly recommend you take these classes so you can be a competitive professional. Another motivational theory that has really set the framework for motivational strategies is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, your book does a pretty good job of going over this, and the Connect Interactive showed you a video of it. And so I'll just quickly go over its main component parts. There are 5 sequential needs that Maslow says must be met. And at the bottom of that is the physiological needs, and it's pretty primal. Your need for water, your food, your shelter, your clothing, and once those are met, Maslow says you will then go after your security needs, and that's a protection from physical and economic harm. And then after that, you will, having met those, you will go after your social needs, love, companionship, and friendship. After that, you'll see, if you're lucky enough to go to esteem needs, to look for self-respect and respect from others, and then look and be motivated to pursue self-actualization needs. And you can further categorize these in 3 different buckets. The bottom 2 would be your basic needs, and then you have your psychological needs as well as your self-fulfillment needs. And you could imagine that if you espouse this theory, that your motivational strategies would also have to be sequential. And a criticism of this particular theory is the idea that, it is quite possible to have several needs met at once or that are out of order. There are certain jobs, for example, that will offer you, the upper deck, the love, the friendship, the social needs, esteem needs, and self-actualization needs. And that all the other security needs and physiological needs might be met elsewhere in your life. An interesting commentary on the hierarchy of needs that you see here is what our society has done to address the basic needs of people. For example, we have passed federal and state minimum wage laws to address the security needs and physiological needs of families and individuals, as well as offer certain safety nets like unemployment benefits. And as the cost of our quality of life increases and the gap between the very rich and the poor increases, there is greater tension as to whether or not these, fundamental principles of sustainability are even holding together. And so that's why you will see a lot of debate and, increasing movement towards the $15 minimum wage law, because of how, what it would actually take in order to just meet these basic needs. So you'll hear, for example, people calling them living wage, that they're going after the living wage. And behind that really is this, to be able to meet the, the primal and basic needs of people so that they can live in our society. But that we have to have a minimum floor upon which then people can stand and say, I can live with this income. And then, should the job also provide them other needs like psychological and self-fulfillment, then that is just the nature of the job. But that the argument is that jobs in general should meet a basic fundamental set of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs also informs quite a few other motivational theories, one of which is Herzberg's two-factor theory. And he organizes his theory around, context and content. So one of which is hygiene factors, and hygiene here is really the meaning of that is conditions, or conditions of work like wages, comfort and safety, job security, that sort of thing. And then the secondary set of factors he called motivational factors, and that's sort of the content of the work that would affect the inner drive to achieve goals. So if you were to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the way you would then look at that is, the hygiene factors would be these two tiers, the security needs and the physiological needs, right? And then so that would be like salary and job security. And then the upper decks would be considered your motivational factors, like people's inner drive for achievement, recognition, involvement in the work, having a sense of responsibility and advancement. So that's how those Herzberg two factors are organized. And practical applications of that would be to give employees more responsibility and control. So in this case, Herzberg, argued that you could really affect motivation only in the upper decks, really realistically speaking, and that in order to do that, you got to give people more responsibility and control, and that you seek their involvement in the work design and the delivery of the product or the service. And some considerations to be able to pursue successful motivational strategies then is to offer training at the supervisor and subordinate levels. And what does that mean? That, for example, supervisors, in order to, be able to give up control, they'd have to learn how to do that so they're not micromanagers, but still be able to oversee the work. Right? There's a balance there. And that to be able to pick the right persons to do the right job so that they can be set up for success. So for example, you would not want to, give somebody a job that they were not prepared to do, that did not have the skill sets to do, because that would set them up, for failure. Or you wouldn't want to give somebody who's overly qualified to do a job, because that would set them for failure as well, because then they would be, bored and they may slack. So it's important to make sure that supervisors are trained to be able to pick the right people for the right job, and that the subordinates are then trained to be able to do the job as well. Another important work consideration is for the ability of leadership to embrace a participative orientation. And this is really to be able to use motivational strategies that tap into what's called the 4 C's. Critical thinking skills, two-way communication, productive collaboration, and people's creativity skills. Not only to be able to meet their upper needs that you see there on the hierarchy of needs, but also for the organization to benefit from them. And in order to do that, you will have to have a leadership style that is participatory, because it does require the involvement of people and their advancement through the ranks in order to fully realize, the organizational needs. And again, this is about, sort of recognizing where the actual state of employees and organizations are currently, and where the organization would like to be able to get to a desired state, and that is really the attainment of organizational goals. And in this framework, the elimination of that gap is really tapping into people's higher order skills. And in this case, the argument goes, to be able to do that, you'll have to tap into the 4 C's. And in order to be able to tap into those 4 C's, there has to be leadership that's committed to people's growth through, a participatory orientation. The next set of motivational theories take into account the managerial perspective and how it then informs the kind of motivational strategies that are employed. McGregor's X and Y are grouped into the traditional and the humanistic, and I'll go over them here in a moment. And it's important to keep in mind that these two organize themselves around Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory. So a theory X traditional perspective is when the management sort of regards the worker as one who dislikes work and who will avoid it whenever possible, and that worker must be forced or controlled to be able to do the job, and that the worker prefers to be directed because they want to avoid responsibility, and that has little ambition and whose main intent is job security. The managerial motivational strategies that are pursued then are that of control over the workers and of constant supervision, so they're motivated to do the work, and of course, the use of fear to keep them going, and that the decision making is autocratic, because the assumption is that they want to be directed, they don't want decision making, and so the decision making must reside at the top, and that very little input is sought from workers, and that the focus again is on Maslow's physiological and security needs. So if the perspective is that employees need to be coerced to do the job, and that they really are just seeking to meet their security needs, then the managerial motivational strategies to get people to move from one place, their actual state, to meaning they don't really want to do the work, to the desired state that they really want to work, is to motivate them through fear and constant supervision and a very controlled atmosphere. In contrast, the motivational theory called Y is humanistic, and that assumes a perspective that workers like to work, that they seek responsibility, and that the effort they put towards work is really the same as in play or rest, and that once they are committed to work, they have a commitment to work, they will then be self-directed and will exercise self-control, and that the average person really wants to, they really accept the responsibility and indeed seek it, and that the perspective there is that creativity is integral to high performance, and even though they're little tap, they can be brought about through certain motivational strategies. So in this case, you would use less control and supervision. So if you as a manager espouse the theory Y perspective, you would not use fear as a primary motivator because people are already seeking responsibility. There's no need for that. And that democratic decision making would then be appropriate. And in order for this to work, there would have to be a flatter organization where leadership really sort of assumes the role of participative decision making and leadership, sort of playing the role of coach and guide in order to get the job done, and that the focus is really on the upper decks of Maslow's hierarchy of needs to meet social, esteem, self-actualization needs, right? And if you didn't think that X and Y were enough, there is actually a theory Z, and at the heart of that is employee participation. This was promoted by William Ouchi in his book Theory Z: How American Business Can Meet the Japanese Challenge. And in that, he kind of talked about the Japanese principles of trust and intimacy, where managers or workers shared responsibility for organizational objectives, and that there was this participative management style, and together this commitment, sort of this two-way commitment resulted in organizational ownership, in that the employer is committed to the employee, and so therefore the employee is committed to the employer. And at the heart of that really is this factor where a condition where employees have long-term, lifelong employment, and that it yielded competitive opportunities or advantages for the company, because you had folks who were motivated to do what needed to be done for the organization to be successful. So they were in constant desired state mode, given this commitment and ownership towards organizational goals. There were, of course, challenges, because long-term or lifelong employment would pose economic pressures for a company that espoused this, theory, because during good times it's fine, there's plenty of cash to work with, but during economic downturns, a company may, keep more workers than it needs. But that is part of the bargain and the trade-off of Theory Z. And the focus here is the bottom rungs of Maslow's hierarchy, and that is the physiological security needs. And the central to that motivation is this dual, commitment towards each other, employee and employer. Another theory that has particular relevance today is that of equity. And it basically goes something like, as a worker, your contribution would depend on your sense of fairness, of the rewards that you received in exchange. This is, of course, highly subjective and in need of comparison. So how much a worker puts into the work and the work that is produced, and the ratio of that is relative to other comparisons. So for example, my performance my input-output ratio might be compared to my CEO's compensation. And so, for example, I put in this much work and I get this kind of, X amount as a result of it. And then I might measure that against what my CEO puts forward and the compensation that they're getting. In today's news, you will probably recall that there have been a lot of controversy in how much CEOs are getting, and that their compensation packages are many, many times over how much the regular employee is getting. And so there is a sense of inequity in that case. And that there were stories, for example, in Walmart where their treatment of employees and the kinds of compensation they received seemed to be a lot less than they employee deserved, and so that bred about employee resentment. And then it had this correlation between that resentment and the increase in theft. And so how that goes is this idea that if an employee felt like the work that they were contributing were not in return getting just rewards, that they were going to somehow make it up through theft. It is regrettable, but it has been shown to have a direct correlation. And that a way to address this is to make sure that performance actually relate equitably to rewards, right? And that it is explained clearly to the workers the basis for pay and benefits, so there is no sort of surprise at the end when they get it. Another set of theories, I'll go very quickly on this idea of expectancy and goal setting. And expectancy really is an optimistic point of view that, you Your motivation really is dependent on what you want, your sort of sense of optimism that you will get, a reward for that, and that since you are motivated, you will then likely pursue it. The goal setting is sort of similar in the sense that the goal is the motivation, and that it directs people's attention and focus to getting the outcome. And it further goes to say that when managerial objectives, organizational objectives are linked to personal objectives and they're aligned, that the managers then are committed to the organizational goals. They are more likely to move from actual state into desired state, or to maintain sort of the desired state of pursuing organizational objectives when their professional and personal objectives are aligned and not in conflict. And at the bottom of that really is this idea of directional motivation, meaning you have a purpose and that purpose is clear, and therefore one then is committed to success. There are several motivational strategies that can then be employed in this case, and that is to link behavior to consequence. And in this case, consequence can be positive or negative, and there are generally 4 types of reinforcements. And so for some of you who may be parents, you might recognize some, application of this in your day-to-day life. So positive in the sense is that you get a bonus for extraordinary performance, so you want to reward the activity with, a bonus. There is also reinforcement called avoidance, and the way that really goes is to avoid a negative consequence. So you do something in order to avoid a negative consequence. So for example, if you were charged to do a presentation, instead of going at home at the regular time, you might work late to be able to, produce quality work so that you don't have a negative performance in the morning. So you avoid sort of the possibility of a negative performance. And punishments are pretty straightforward, and they can run the gamut from, small punishments to big punishments. Demotions would be in the category of larger punishments in this case. And then the idea of extinction. And this is the extinction of certain things like the loss of bonuses or the loss of a job. Other motivational strategies are around job design, one of which is job rotation, and that is to move from one job to another, primarily to avoid boredom. And it's also ideal for training so that no one or a few people in the organization can do the job. And so it prepares organizations to be able to continue with these operations when somebody is absent. So that's really ideal. And then there's also job enlargement, which basically adds more tasks to a job. Again, this is to address boredom and to promote development. And another motivational strategy is to not only add more tasks, but to give more control and authority over the job. And it prepares workers for more responsibility as well as to address boredom. So it's motivating in that way. And then there are flexible schedules, and this goes beyond the traditional work week. You may be in your particular position now benefiting from some of these strategies. So flex time is being able to work, outside of the traditional 8-hour work day. So you may, start at a different time and at a different time, and that's your time is just flexible. And that you have compressed work weeks. So instead of 5 days a week working 8 hours a day, you might have 4 days where you work 10 hours a week. And then there's also job sharing, and that's particularly motivational for parents who have responsibilities for loved ones. And also a really attractive motivational strategy now is telecommuting, to be able to work at home. And so the idea here is that we really focus on productivity as opposed to controlling the work day. So this brings us to our summary around the importance of motivating employees. And basically, our economy really is in need of increasingly more people with high skills. And highly skilled workers have different needs that need to be met at once. And so they're not just looking to meet their security needs. And in this sense, the managerial strategies to motivate employees also have to be very diverse, right? Because there's more women who are working, there are more groups who've traditionally been disenfranchised from the workforce that are now in the workforce, and they're highly skilled and highly educated. And so a one-size-fits-all motivational strategy may not be enough. So your toolkit of motivational strategies may also need to be diverse so that you can tap talents in your company. And it's also important to keep in mind that under varied economic conditions, different sets of motivational strategies would need to be deployed. So for example, during good times when highly skilled workers can jump from one job to another because they have choices, basically there's a demand for their job, and the kinds of motivational strategies would probably have to be on the upper decks of that hierarchy of needs according to Maslow. And then during recessionary times, people's needs may go a little lower into those hierarchy of needs, because they want to have job security, and so the kinds of motivational strategies would also have to match those according to the theory. But at the same time, not to forget that even though there may be more focus at those lower decks, that your highly skilled and highly valued workers are still wanting to have self-actualization, their self-actualization needs met. So just because economic times may be down does not mean that their interest may not be there. It's just that they may be focused a little bit more on the lower rungs of those hierarchy of needs. But it's important that when economic times actually get better, you don't lose those people because those people to other employers because the wrong set of strategies were employed during the bad times, because you don't want them to become resentful and seek other employers who may appreciate them more. This really brings us to the bottom line, that the right motivation, depending on people's needs and economic conditions and other factors, really result in happy, productive workers that are then in the desired state of meeting organizational objectives, and that kind of condition affords the company competitive advantage, and that is no small thing. That brings us to the end of this video. I thank you very much for listening, and I will talk with you again soon.